We want to be sure we understand the integrated nature of the Mississippi College and Career Readiness ELA standard. So English language arts, you need to be really careful in your mind not to separate that into reading and English or reading and language arts. Reading is one of the language arts. So the language arts are reading, writing, speaking, listening, things like grammar, mechanics, vocabulary, all of that has to do with language. And it's very integrated. And we never completely master language. Even as adults, we haven't completely mastered all the ins and outs and complexities of language. And so we need to really understand that the skills are not linear. So it's not like you learn to do this, and then you learn to do this, and then you learn to do this. All the skills of ELA, of language, are what we call iterative. So in kindergarten, kids are reading, writing, speaking, listening, thinking, learning vocabulary, learning how to use reference materials. In first grade, kids are reading, writing, speaking, listening, all those things. And so it just keeps on going. It's in cycles. So throughout your lifetime, reading and language and writing skills, all of those they happen in cycles. And what gets more and more complex is the text itself. So it's not that the skills change, but the complexity of the text changes throughout life. So that's what we're going to really look at very closely today. And I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start just walking through to make sure that we have a really, really good handle on the integrated nature of our standards. So this is what I said earlier, that it's iterative and integrated. The standards are not linear. And so what I've done here is I just took some statements straight from the MCCR standards document. It's on the Mississippi Department of Education webpage. And this says, I'll just read it. Although the standards are divided into reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language, that's just for clarity, for conceptual clarity. But what they want you to really understand is all of these processes are closely connected. And then the document goes on to say, often, and I would even say always, several standards can be addressed by a single rich task. So as I said earlier, we don't want to think about, well, kids go to reading class and then they go to English class. No, the standards were never designed for such an artificial wall between it's all in one standards document. It's one set of standards. So here's another thing from the standards. Students should write before, during, and after reading text. So it's really important that before students read text, they put pencil to paper, or they put their fingers on a keyboard. However, if your kids are writing on paper pencil, which there's a huge body of research to say that reading a book from paper and writing with a pencil or a pen on paper is better for all of us, kids and adults. It's better for all of us. It deepens our understanding better than digital. But if you have chosen to use digital, then, I'll be back and forth saying things like writer's notebooks or digital documents. So print text or digital text, whichever you've chosen. But I do want you to understand the research says print and writing with a pencil or pen on paper is best for understanding text. But your choice or the district's choice, how you do that. But just because the test at the end of the year is digital, that doesn't mean all your learning to prepare for that should be digital. Never, ever, ever think that. So a quick note here about this writing that kids are doing before, during, and after they read text. You should always be looking at that and assessing it. I am not saying grading it. There is a major mountain of difference between assessing and grading. When you're assessing student work, it's to inform your immediate instructional next steps. Don't think of assessment as being just for a grade or just for grouping students or just for, no, the assessment is for you as the teacher. It's for you to determine what you do next. So kids should write before, during, and after they read text. And then you as the teacher need to be always looking at that writing. And you're looking to see if they have, if they're understanding the RL standards, and if they're understanding the language standards, as well as if they're understanding the writing standards. So as you're informally assessing all the writing that students are doing, once you assess that, then you'll know more about which language and which reading foundation standards you need to teach. Now, what we don't want to do is think of the language standards and the reading foundation standards as being something that kids have to learn and master before they can read or write. That's not the way the standards are designed. That's not the way language works, actually. You don't ever want to spend a whole lot of time teaching kids something they already know. I sometimes liken it to a spelling test. So let's say that you're going to test on some certain words on a Friday. Well, if kids already know how to spell those words on Monday, then you're wasting your time giving them any instruction around those words Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So we don't want to spend a lot of time. Actually, it's wasted time teaching kids something they already know. So hold that. We'll address this later. So basically from this slide, what I want you to take away is kids should be reading, writing, speaking, listening all the time, like every day. That's what your classroom should look like. You should be teaching several standards each day, and kids should be writing before they read, during their reading, and after their reading. And you're keeping an eye on that writing to see, okay, what do they know about conventions? What do they know about spelling? What do they know about phonics? What are they, all of these things? You're keeping an eye on that because you need to know what language and RF standards you actually need to spend your time teaching. Okay, so let's move ahead. And so as you all well know, in the ELA classroom, 50% of your time should be spent on literary text and 50% on informational text. And a lot of your time should be spent on you're actually, as the teacher, teaching them how to read these texts. So a big combination of you teaching through modeling and think aloud, and then them practicing what you have, the skills that you have modeled. And so your major instructional focus every single day should be on the reading standards, whether it's literature or information, the writing standards. Kids should be speaking and listening all during class, and then the language standards that deal with vocabulary and knowledge of language. That's your major instructional focus every single day. Anytime someone walks into your classroom, they should see kids gathered around a common text, talking about, reading the text, talking about the text, grappling with the meaning, writing their way through the text, reading with a pencil. That's what should be seen. There are other times that minor instructional focus should be based on your students' needs after you have formatively assessed their writing. So they're writing all the way through the text, okay? Reading, writing, talking, all the way through a text. And then you as a teacher are keeping your eye on that writing, and you can tell from the writing your students' knowledge of phonics, spelling, and conventions. That's the way you assess that. Things that you're seeing that your kids are repeatedly leaving out of that or misusing, then there should be times when you pull groups of students together, or you can pull the whole group together and do a mini lesson on this spelling pattern, or this capitalization rule, or this punctuation rule. Here, class, here's the way you punctuate a title of a poem. Here's the way you punctuate the title of a short story or a book. All of that should be based on what you're seeing in your students' writing. If most of your students have mastered those things already and it's not a problem, never, ever, ever would you want to spend a whole lot of your class time wasting it on teaching that skill that maybe only one or two or even none of them even need. So again, you're reading text every day, 50-50 literary and informational. You're teaching, you're thinking, kids are working, writing and talking through that text. And then you are walking around assessing their mastery of conventions and knowledge of language, and then those reading foundation standards. All right. So one more quick word about the text types. Now, you know, kids take that end of year test every day. Here's reading standard 10. They're supposed to be able to, your kids at every grade level are supposed to read and comprehend complex, which means grade level, literary and informational text independently and proficiently. So the end of year test, grade 3, 4, and 5, there's a 50-50 mix on that test. Grade 6, 7, and 8, it goes to, you know, there's 2 literature passages and 3 informational passages in those middle school grades. And then by the time the kids get to high school, 2 literature passages and 4 informational passages. Now that's important. So again, as I've already said, you're the ELA teacher. The ELA teacher, you're teaching reading and writing every day in your classroom. You should be teaching a 50-50 mix of literary and informational. This next slide, here's another statement from the document. Kids should also be reading text, not just copying notes from the board, reading text in history, social studies, and science and other disciplines, because that's that informational text. As they progress through the grades, they read more informational text than literary text. And a lot of these informational texts are being read outside the ELA classroom. Here's a quote I found that really goes along with this. Ensuring that all students develop high levels of literacy, and that's what we want. We want all our students to be highly literate. So in order to ensure that that happens, schools have to make concerted, coordinated, working together efforts to improve students' proficiency as readers, writers, and critical and creative thinkers. This will increase student achievement, which leads to higher graduation rates. So unless you have school-wide literacy, kids are reading and writing almost all day. They're less of it in math, but the other subjects, reading and writing, you can read and write in math too, of course, but the majority of your school-wide literacy is happening in the ELA class, in the science class, and in the history class. We owe it to our students. We owe it to them. When they graduate, the majority of the text they're going to read in their daily lives and at their work and in college is going to be informational text. Everybody has to work together on this. Okay, so sometimes people ask me, well, which standards should I teach each 9 weeks? So pacing guide, should I have a pacing guide? No, you should not have a pacing guide, because the standards were not designed to be paced in that fashion. And so if your students, remember, these standards are not linear. So if your students are reading a literary text on any given day, then you should be teaching all of the RL standards with that text. Simple. Simple. Why would you leave any of them out? Now, we do know that RI8 does not, I mean, RL8, there's not an RL8. Reading Standard 8 does not apply to literature. And we also know that 10 has to do with just the complexity of the text and the range of reading. So what that means is, for a literary text, let's say your kids are reading a short story, a poem, or a novel that day, you can be teaching and assessing in that text 8 RL standards. There really are only 8 that you would teach and assess. Do all 8. If you're teaching an informational text, do all 9 of the RI standards. Now, we do know that Standard 9, R9, whether it's RL9 or RI9, it means you have to do multiple texts. You can't always teach that one, but all the others, you should be teaching as many as you can, which is most of them, with every single text you teach. There's a document here. I'm going to open it later and walk you through it. But the document contains question stems for each reading standard. So questions you can ask your students as they're reading every text they read. Every text they read, you're teaching most or all of the standards with that text. So it doesn't make sense to say, well, we're going to teach our reading standards 1 through 3 the first 9 weeks, 4 through 6 the second 9 weeks, and then we'll work on 7 through 9 the next 9 weeks. No, because in order to deeply understand a text, students have to be able to apply all of the standards to every text. So do not think in terms of pacing guides, think in terms of iterative, cyclical, teaching all the standards with every text in every grade. Okay, so let's just keep moving. Here's like a sample instructional sequence for a literary text. So read the text, of course, and then there's teacher modeling and think aloud. You can do the two with an individual. So maybe the teacher reads the first little bit of the text, and then kids partner read, and then individual read, that gradual release of responsibility. Sometimes teachers want kids to read the entire passage all the way through, answer a few low-level questions, some detail-level questions about the passage, and then you start really grappling with that text and digging into it through the lens of all those other standards together as a class. The entire time you're reading, you're modeling how to determine vocabulary and context. You may be doing some mini lessons on vocabulary. You may pull out and say, okay, this text has lots of Greek and Latin roots, so we're going to do some L3 things with that, L4, language standard 4. I'm going to do a quick mini lesson here. If it's a literary text, you might say this text has lots of figurative language. So I'm going to do a quick mini lesson on figurative language. And then in addition to writing all the way through the text, then students need to do some culminating piece of writing at the end. So after kids read a text, they need to write a narrative, or they need to write a literary analysis, or they need to write, something at the end of that text, some long piece of writing, fairly long, page or more piece of writing. If it's a new mode that you haven't taught before, you have to teach them how to do it. If they've never written an argument or an opinion, you have to teach them how to do that. If they've never written a literary analysis, you have to teach them how to do that. If they've never written an informational problem solution or cause effect or steps in a sequence, you have to teach them that if it's the first time they've done that mode of writing. And then after the kids write that piece, you as the teacher spread them all out in front of you, and you look and you see what are the patterns of spelling, what are the patterns of conventions, punctuation, capitalization, what are kids doing well, what do they need you to do a mini lesson with them on. You don't want to just say, okay, this week or this month I'm going to teach the dash, the colon, and the semicolon. Okay, well, if you look at kids' papers and they know how to do that, then no, you wouldn't spend a whole month, or week doing that. You don't want to waste time teaching things to kids that they already know. So that's a sample instructional sequence for literary. Here's a sample instruction for informational, kind of the same thing here. So of course you read the text, and all during the reading, kids have a pencil in their hand, or if it's a digital text, they're writing comments, or they can be looking at a digital text on the screen and jotting notes on sticky notes or in a writer's notebook. But they need to write their way all the way through the text. You're teaching vocabulary and context, and you might say, hey, I notice a lot of you're struggling with this type of word. Let me do a little mini lesson to teach you the structure of this type of word, or Greek and Latin root, or figurative language, or whatever type of words they're struggling with. Or if kids aren't using a certain type of context clue, they're 5 different types of context clues. And if you see that kids are not doing well with one or more, you might pull aside and say, hey, everybody stop. Let me remind you, let me teach this context clue. Let me reteach this context clue. Kids are answering text-dependent questions. I have some question stems. I'll link here. I'm going to open the document in a minute and show it to you. And then kids are going to do some culminating writing. Again, if it's a new mode, you have to teach it. You can't just assign it. And then after they write, you analyze it to see, okay, what are the reading foundations, like the phonics skills that they're not doing well, and what are the language conventions that I need to teach a mini lesson on. You might just pull a small group for that, just the ones who aren't doing well. Why would you waste somebody's time if they understand that phonics rule? Why would you waste somebody's time if they understand that spelling rule? Why would you waste somebody's time if they understand that punctuation rule or capitalization rule? You want to individualize that instruction on an as-needed basis. Okay, so since I just mentioned reading foundation skills, sometimes people say, well, what about those? Don't I need to teach them first? Don't kids need to master those reading foundation skills in K-5 before they can actually start reading some text? And the answer is no, 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 and no again. Of course they don't. And this comes straight from the document. These foundational skills are not an end in and of themselves, which means you're not going to like test all of those and do a whole unit on it and a big test, because that's not the end, okay? Rather, they learn those so that they can read proficiently. You teach those so that they can comprehend text. And then instruction should be differentiated. So if kids are struggling to comprehend a text, then of course you need to analyze why. And then you may find out, oh, there are a few reading foundation skills that this kid or this group of students is not really understanding. I need to pull them back, reteach that, make sure they've got that, keep an eye on them to make sure they keep that understanding. But you don't stop everything and teach the whole class something that, you know, maybe 60% of them are already doing well. The point is, and I got this straight from the standards, good readers will need less practice with those. And the point is to teach students what they need to learn and not what they already know. So you're going to have to keep your finger on the pulse as the teacher and decide when certain children or certain standards need more or less of your attention. Okay, so what about writing and conventions of language? Well, what you need to be sure that you do not do is you do not need to teach those conventions of language standards, which is R1 and R2. 1 is punctuation and 2 is spelling. You don't teach those apart from writing. This comes straight from your standards document. Skills related to conventions are inseparable from reading, writing, speaking, and listening. The conventions of language standards always state when writing. So students will spell correctly when writing. Students will punctuate correctly when writing. It's the only way it's assessed on the state test, and you need to teach it in that context. Okay. So what do I mean when I say look at students writing and decide who needs to be taught what from that? Well, after students read a text, then they need to produce some writing. And the writing needs to be source-based writing. It needs to come from that text. So they're writing something about that text, an argument or an opinion, an informative or explanatory piece or a narrative. And then after they have written, then you're going to analyze that writing, and you're going to make decisions about which language standards you need to focus on in whole group, small group, and individual instruction. So like I said earlier, spread those papers out. Ooh, this whole stack of kids has trouble with spelling. Analyze it more closely. What spelling patterns are they missing? This stack is having trouble with capitalization or punctuation. A lot of times it's going to be the same kids, right? So the same kids are going to struggle with conventions. Those are the ones that you need to do quick mini lessons. It could be they're just not being careful. Maybe they know how to use it, but they didn't. That's an error. Errors are different from they don't know how. So you can't make an error if you don't know how to do something. An error is when you do know how and you either didn't do it or you kind of messed it up. Just like the reading standards. Don't ever ask, which standard should I teach which 9 weeks? You should teach all of them every 9 weeks. You should teach as many as possible with every text. The writing standards are the same way. So a lot of times people will say to me, we're going to do narrative first. We're going to spend a whole 9 weeks on narrative. And then we're going to spend a whole 9 weeks on informational. And then we're going to spend a whole 9 weeks on argument. No, 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 and no. So if you wonder what my answer to that would be, the answer is no. After you read informational text, you're either going to write an argument or an informative explanatory piece. After you read a piece of literature, you're going to write a narrative or an informative explanatory piece. And so if you're doing a 50-50 mix in your classroom, let's say you're reading, and you should be reading a text every day, and there are 9 times 5, 45 days in 9 weeks, then, you know, if it's a short passage, you can read one of those each day, or at least 2 or 3 a week. If it's a chapter book or a novel, then, you know, it might take a 9 weeks, but you can't have a novel take a whole 9 weeks. That's not possible if you're teaching the standards, because the standards say you have a 50-50 mix, right? So you can't spend a whole 9 weeks on a novel, because then you're just not doing your job, which is to teach a 50-50 mix. So you're not teaching a novel anyway, you're teaching standards using the novel. So my point is, you don't think in terms of what types of writing am I going to do each 9 weeks. The answer is you're going to do all of them every 9 weeks. So kids should have, by the end of the year, written lots of arguments. By the end of the year, they should have written lots of narratives. And by the end of the year, they should have written lots of literary analysis or informational pieces. Kids don't get good at doing something by doing it once a year. That's impossible. The things that I'm really good at, the things you're really good at, are things you do regularly, consistently. You do it often. There's no way we should expect kids to write every year in school. They're going to write narratives the first 9 weeks, and then somehow we think they're going to be good at that. No, no, and no, they won't be. So lots of reading, lots of writing, lots of talking every single day. Don't waste a second ever. Our kids don't have time. They can't afford for us to be wasting their time. So kids are writing all the time. You're assessing it all the time to decide which language standards that you're going to teach. And so here's the big takeaway. Let's put it all together here. When do you teach this? Which standards? Well, remember, it's iterative, which means cyclical. You're doing it again and again and again, different iterations. Cyclical, not a line where you have, I'm going to teach these standards, and then this standard, and then this standard, and then this standard, and then this standard. No, you're not. You're going to teach lots of them at the same time. And you're reading a 50-50 balance. And so when you read the 50% of the time that you're reading literature, you're teaching all 8 of the RL standards. And the 50% of the time that you're reading informational text, you're teaching all of the RI standards, all 9 of them. You're going to teach all 3 writing types during each grading period. You're going to teach the reading foundation standards as needed to the students who need those. You're going to teach L4 all year. That's determining words in context. You're going to teach that all year. You're going to teach the conventions of language standards, which is punctuation and spelling. You're going to teach those as needed to the kids who still need those. You're going to teach knowledge of language and vocabulary and acquisition of language, which is L3, L4, L5, and L6, when your texts call for them. So for example, you know, some of these standards right here are about, you know, like figurative language. So if you're reading poetry or a piece of literature that's using a lot of figurative language, that's when you're going to teach that. And then if you're teaching an informational text that has lots of Greek and Latin roots, that's when you're going to teach those. So you're going to teach them as your texts call for them. So that's that part. And so if you came away with nothing from that except that you're teaching all the standards all the time, there's no such thing as a pacing guide for ELA. It's not like math where kids have to learn to add before they can multiply. It's not like math where kids have to learn to subtract before they can divide, or, you know, I mean, no. All the standards look pretty much the same every year for a reason. It's because you need repeated exposure to those standards every year, just with more and more complex text. Now I'm going to share another document that I referred to. And it's this one. So, you know, we hear a lot since the new standards came out, and I don't know why I'm calling them new. They came out in 2012. So we've had these standards nearly a decade. And so one of the things that we've learned so much about is close reading of a text, or if you're reading two texts, then, you know, close reading of two texts. So let me go back up here. Text types, 50-50. You always want to integrate them. There's no such thing as a linear pacing guide for the ELA standards. It just doesn't work that way. Kids don't understand it because it doesn't make sense. And definitely language is about meaning. ELA is all about meaning. It's got to make sense. So we don't want to, you know, as adults, we don't want to create a document that makes no sense to, we don't want to create a teaching approach that doesn't make sense. Then we're not doing our jobs. We're committing malpractice. So I talked a lot about close reading and reading with a pencil. And so kids need to have that pencil in their hand all the time, you know, while they're reading. And I created this table, not quite finished with it, but by the time you get it, it's going to be completely done and finished. But I just want to kind of show you the direction where I'm going with this. So any text that you're reading, if it's a literary text or an informational text, you should be teaching all the reading standards, these 4 language standards, the writing standards, and the speaking listening standards. So here's just a quick example. So pre-reading, you know how you'll hand kids a text and you'll say flip through, or, you know, look through it just to kind of get the lay of the land. That's called surveying the text. Look at text features. If it's literature, look at some illustrations, or the author, or look at when it was written, look at the copyright. Look at the about the author. So here's some things you do during the pre-reading. You survey the text to get the lay of the land. You can make predictions based on the title or the subheadings or the text features. And then you notice, how is this put together? And then I like to let kids do an internet search to learn more about the author or writer of the text. What other things have they written? A little bit about their background. Are they still alive or deceased? When did they live? And so during the pre-reading stage, kids have their pencil in their hand or their fingers on a keyboard. So in notebooks or a digital document, they can be jotting predictions or making claims, writing their prior knowledge based on this survey of the text. After they do this, they turn and talk to share what they wrote. Lots of talking. Reading, writing, talking, noticing. Okay, then kids are going to read the text the first time. As I said earlier, a lot of times teachers like for that first reading to be cold. Other times teachers are modeling some skills, doing a think aloud, reading part of it to the kids. So the first reading is when you scratch the surface of the text. That's the first 3 reading standards 1, 2, and 3. Those standards are like, what is the big picture? What are some important parts? What are the details that build the big picture? Summarizing the text. Okay. While the students are doing that, they're jotting in notebooks. You're going to ask them some questions that go along with standards 1, 2, and 3. I'll show you some of those in a few minutes. And then they're going to be jotting their answers, and then they're going to turn and talk, or you're going to lead a whole group conversation where they say what answers they got. So it's like a quick assessment for you. So during the first read, you're focusing on standards 1, 2, and 3. If kids are jotting answers, then you as the teacher have that immediate formative assessment, and you know, okay, they're doing really well on standard 1, not so well on standard 3. So then you know, I don't need to focus too much on teaching standard 1. I need to jump to standard 3 and work on it right now. Okay. So then after you've scratched the surface, and I'm not quite finished with some of these middle columns, but after you've scratched the surface on the second read, you're going to start digging more deeply. And that's standards 4, 5, and 6, craft and structure. So a quick word here, when I said you want to teach all of the standards with every text, if you're on, let's say standard first 9 weeks, let's say you have a pacing guide that says the first 9 weeks, you're going to teach standards 1, 2, and 3. Well, that's silly and ridiculous because all you would be doing is scratching the surface of every text that you teach. You don't want to do that. You want to get the surface, the big picture, and the details, so key ideas and details. Then you want to go deeper with craft and structure. That's these next 3 standards for reading standards 4, 5, and 6. It's also language standards 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you start to dig more deeply about how did the writer write this text? You're looking at the author's choices, and it can be word choice, structure choice, which words did they choose, which means you have to teach kids to figure out the meaning of words using context clues, which is reading standard 4 and also language standard 4. But the big takeaway here is that during the second reading, you're digging more deeply into how was it put together, organizational features, author's choices, how did the text features support your meaning making, or how, if it's R8, how did the author develop the argument? And then the writing standards that you're using there are also, you're still writing through the text, you're jotting your answers to the questions that the teacher is asking in your notebook or in your digital document. And then as you answer those questions in writing, you're going to turn and talk to somebody, to a one person, a small group, or do a whole group conversation. I like turn and talk first because it adds more accountability. And then as the teacher, how are you going to assess whether or not kids are getting these 3 reading standards and these language standards? You're going to look at what they wrote right here in their notebook. All right. And then on the third reading, which is integration of knowledge and ideas, that's when you do reading standards 7, 8, and 9. What do you know now that you didn't know before? What big message, theme, or idea can you apply to your life? What did you learn about finding information, analyzing media, etc.? 3 reads, each read goes a little bit deeper, and then your big takeaway. All right. Now, I'm going to click on this document, and we're going to open this. These are question stems for all of the reading standards. So remember, you want to read everything 3 times, first for key ideas and details, first 3 standards, then for craft and structure, second 3 standards, and then for integration of knowledge and ideas, the next 3 standards. Scrape the surface, dig more deeply. What are the big takeaways? New knowledge and ideas that you can apply. Okay, so I'm just going to choose, let's just go 5th grade. So I have created these documents for you to use freely. And for each of the standards, so the first reading, remember, is key ideas and details. If it's a literary text, here's RL standard 1. If it's an informational text, RI standard 1 is over here. And below, here are questions you can ask your students. You can ask them orally. You can turn this into a test. But these are the types of questions that you want to ask to be sure that kids can do RL1. So all of these questions for RL, all of these questions for RI. And I have them also for reading standard 2. Here's RL2, determine theme, and RI2, main ideas and details. Theme and details. Characterization. Main idea, details, summarize, summarize. Okay. And then here are questions you can ask. Kids can answer these while they read, turn and talk, turn their answers into you. You can model how you answer these questions. You can put these questions on a test and get a quick grade. Different types of questions for each standard. And so that's what these documents are. And then for the third reading, craft and structure, these three standards. Here are questions you can ask your students for RL and RI. So let's say, and then the third read, integration of knowledge and ideas. So let's say you're reading a poem, okay? Which standards would you teach when you're reading a poem? All the RL standards that apply to poetry, which is almost all of them. Let's say you're reading a short story. Which RL standards are you going to teach? All of them. Or a novel? All of them. And then you're going to, as kids read, they answer these questions, or after they read, they answer the questions, and it can be a test, or you're modeling think alouds with these questions. Same with RI. If you're teaching an informational text, you're going to ask as many of these questions as you can while you're teaching, while kids are reading that text. Okay, so the big takeaway again is which standards do you teach and when do you teach them? 50-50 balance of RI and RL, which means every grading period, multiple times, you've taught all the RI and RL standards. You're writing after you read every text, so you're teaching all the writing standards and the conventions of language standards. You're doing a lot of talking through all of it, so you're teaching the SL standards. And then those last few language standards, you're teaching them as the text calls for them. The reading foundation standards, you're observing while kids read, and while they write, you're deciding who needs what, and you're teaching that to either the whole group if they all need it, or small groups of kids or individuals who need it. So that's sort of an explanation of when you teach which standards and why. So ELA is a big job. It's exciting. If we do it well, kids will love it. They'll understand things, and they won't see the ELA standards and language as something that they can't do, but rather as something that they can do and they want to do.